Okay, let's talk about epistemology for Karl Marx. Thinking back to our studies of epistemology, we found this theory that started with Descartes and really carried on even through Immanuel Kant, this subject-object dualism. We have the subject, and then we have the thing in itself, okay? Or for Kant, the noumena, okay? And then we had the thing for me, or the phenomena for Immanuel Kant. Now, Marx doesn't see things this way. He doesn't see a subject-object split. He just sees things themselves. In other words, the world is in part, our engagement with the world. We know the world only through making the world our own. Okay, so he rejects this sort of passive kind of interaction with the world, where there's the thing out there, and then it's gathered by our senses, and according to Kant, our mind is acting upon it, and then it presents itself into our mind, and then we come to know it. No, for Karl Marx, we know the world by making it the world our own. Okay, so a person knows the world by making the world his or her own. So knowledge is interactive. It requires our engagement. Okay, and he's very influenced by the philosopher Hegel here. Hegel, in his philosophy, talks about a master bondsman, a lord bondsman relationship. In other words, theoretically, two people were to find themselves, and each one wanted recognition from the other, then they would engage in some kind of fight to the death. And one of them would have to yield, establishing a lord and a bondsman. So the bondsman would essentially have to yield. He or she would have to care about their life so much that they would rather yield to the new lord, than to give up their life. So it creates this dichotomy between the two, and Hegel sees this as the emergence of society, that we find ourselves in these master and slave relationships with each other. But the Lord, wants to understand him or herself through the eyes of the slave, and that's exactly what the Lord gets. Is they understand themselves as Lord by seeing the slave be subservient to them. So the Lord entirely depends for their self-recognition on the bondsman. Okay, even as they try to be independent, the Lord tends to think of himself as an independent agent, and the slave is actually dependent on them. But it's actually quite the reverse, because the slave doesn't require the Lord for the slave's recognition. The slave is doing all the work for the Lord. So the slave is growing the food, building the houses, washing and making the clothes, making the world their own through their labor. Okay, and according to Hegel, the the bondsman, the slave, becomes independent through that process, because you can understand yourself as a self through the gaze of another, but you can also understand yourself and your power and become fundamentally acquainted with your world through labor as well, through your own work. So while the Lord depends on the bondsman's gaze for their understanding of themselves, the bondsman understands himself through labor. And Karl Marx takes this over and sees, that the person who labors in the world comes to know themselves and their world. They make the world their own, and in that way, they know the world. Okay, so it's a very active sort of um, epistemology. Okay, that knowledge requires engagement and making the world your own. Okay, but with the way that we interact with the world, we can interact with it in different ways. One way is passively. Okay, um, and that's where we seek possession and power, uh, and like sensuous satisfaction. Okay, sense satisfaction. Okay, so that is what Marx would consider a passive way of engaging with the world, rather than productivity would be an active way. Okay, so the productive agent gives up having, so gives up possession for being. Okay, having is a very passive way of engaging with the world. So I think we can make sense of this by thinking of some examples. Okay, uh, the student engages with the world. The student is driven to get the degree, and that requires some work. Okay, but you can imagine the passive student versus the productive student. If the passive student is primarily concerned with possessing a degree, okay, so they've got sort of picked their major, and it doesn't matter how they get there. It doesn't matter if they retain the information that they got. What matters to them is that they possess the degree, that they can hang it on their wall when all is said and done. Okay. Now that's very different from the student who almost doesn't care about the title or doesn't care about the diploma, but really is concerned with being the student. And so you can imagine the passionate student who would really study the subject whether or not they were in school, or is really engaged in their classes even when they don't have to be, and is the degree is almost like a side issue. They are just concerned primarily with being, with learning the material, with pursuing knowledge in this area that they're just passionately interested in. Okay, another example would be the art collector. The art collector is consumed with possessing art, hanging it on the wall, and just imagine that distinguished from the artist. Okay, the artist is not so concerned with the final product and having it on the wall. They're concerned with the process itself, the creative moment, you could say. And one example I think of here is Burning Man. If anyone is familiar with the Burning Man festival, I haven't been to it myself, but I have friends who've gone. But I have a friend who has this whole group of really talented people, and they took an old bus and they created it into this spaceship sort of looking bus that was also a kitchen inside. And they weren't doing it, to make money or to have some kind of food cart. They were doing it to take it to Burning Man to feed people. But it's clear if you saw the process that really what they cared about was the construction itself, the architecture itself, the whole design work. And they're all a bunch of mechanical engineers, and just having the experience of wiring this bus. And they spent as much time as someone would spend on a full-time job. I mean, they spent months and months and months and poured resources and money was poured into this bus. And it was really about the experience itself. In fact, none of them even really had clear sense of who owned it. By the time it was done, it wasn't a concern for having a title to that work. It was the work itself was what was important. And sure enough, at Burning Man, in the center of the festival, there's this huge, massive Burning Man monument that, again, engineers, artists, architects, they've all worked together and tons of money and time and resource have been put into it. And at the end of the festival, it gets burned up in flames, and everyone makes a circle around and watches the whole thing burn down. And I think it's a great expression of Marx's ideal, because Marx thought that it's the productive life that fills one with a sense of being. Okay, his criticism of capitalism is that capitalism forces us to be passive with our labor. We have to possess, we're constantly encouraged to possess things. In fact, that's really how capitalism works, because how does a company thrive except they make something that isn't on the market and they convince people that they should possess it, that they need it in some sense. But the people buying it, they had no role in making it. They had no role in deciding that it ought to be made. They're convinced through the marketing, that they need it. And we can all think of examples of things that we really don't need, but we feel like we need. If we don't have them in our possession, we feel sort of empty inside. So Marx's vision of communism is economic relations that really have us give up wanting to own, wanting to possess, and replaces that with being. So Marx is famous for saying that, in a capitalist society, people have labels. Anytime I go to meet someone new, I'm going to be asked, well, what do you do? And then I say, well, I'm a teacher. And Marx is famous for saying that in a communist society, there's no teacher, there's no carpenter, there's no construction worker, there's no engineer. What a person is maybe they're a teacher in the morning, and then they're a carpenter in the afternoon, and then they're an engineer, in the early evening, and they're an artist, later at night. That your labor is freed up, so you labor for the sake of labor. In capitalism, labor is a means to an end. Okay, it's a means to getting money, which is a real need in our society, so that we can buy things and possess them and experience things and be satisfied in those moments, or to gain power over things or even other people. There are certainly power relations, and Marx talked about the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, using their wealth to gain power over the proletariat, which is the working class. Okay, but capitalism promotes that kind of being and discourages productivity or the obsession with being, over having. Marx argues that the more you own, the less you are. The more you work. I think I said that wrong, actually. My apologies. I was misquoting Marx here, and I wanted to get it right, and I didn't want to re-record everything that I just said. So I want to read this Marx quote. Capitalism's principal thesis is the renunciation of life and of human needs. The less you eat, drink, buy books, go to the theater or to balls or to the public house, and the less you think, love, theorize, sing, paint, fence, etc., the more you will be able to save, and the greater will become your treasure, which neither moth nor rust will corrupt, your capital. The less you are, the less you express your life, the more you have. The greater is your alienated life, and the greater is the saving of your alienated being. Okay, and sure